The day I found my husband's hidden note in an old cigar box, I had no idea it would lead to a forged codicil, a staged break-in, my arrest on felony theft, and finally a $400,000 judgment that turned a lake cabin into a women's retreat with a hand-routed plaque reading "Justice Preserves." That box was the first domino, and by the time the last one fell, a man who thought he could steal everything from me was staring at the inside of a federal holding cell while I stood on a dock watching the sun rise over water that was finally, legally, mine. I can still smell the cedar lining, still feel the brass catch under my thumb, and still see James's shaky handwriting on that scrap of lined paper. The note was short, but it carried the weight of a man who knew exactly what was coming, and the truth he buried inside a revolver's grip was the most loving weapon anyone has ever placed in my hands. My name is Laura. I'm 54 years old, and I spent the last 2 years of my marriage as a full-time caregiver, not because I'd been trained for it, but because my husband James was dying of small-cell lung cancer, and I would not let him go through that alone. I'd been a respiratory therapist for 23 years before I took early retirement, and that clinical background meant I could manage his oxygen concentrator, his morphine pump, his pulse oximeter, and the half-dozen other machines that kept him comfortable in our sunroom, which we'd converted into a makeshift hospital ward. One detail that matters later. When I was a teenager, my father ran a small locksmith shop out of a strip mall in Allentown, and I could pick a 5-pin Schlage deadbolt before I could drive. He taught me on a scarred workbench that smelled of graphite and brass shavings, and I still kept his old leather tool roll, the tension wrenches and rake picks worn smooth from his hands, tucked in the back of my bedroom closet like a relic from a life I'd left behind. James was a quiet man, a civil engineer who designed bridges and overpasses and never raised his voice, and his only indulgence was a collection of antique firearms he'd been curating since he was 20. He left me half that collection and a cedar-sided lake cabin on 11 acres of waterfront, free and clear. The cabin sat on Loon Lake, a deep spring-fed body of water where the loons called at dusk, and the fog rolled in so thick some mornings you couldn't see the end of the dock. 3 days after we buried him, while the house still smelled of funeral flowers and cold casserole, the vultures landed. Mark, my stepson from James's first marriage, arrived from San Francisco with his wife Diane in a leased Mercedes that still had the temporary registration taped to the windshield. He wore a charcoal suit that fit him like a second skin and talked about processing the estate before the casserole dishes from the wake had even been washed. Diane was all honeyed vowels and careful false eyelashes, the kind of woman who thinks grief is a performance you stage for the neighbors. She kept patting my hand and saying, "Oh, sweetheart, we're going to handle everything, you just rest," while her eyes cataloged the furniture. The will reading took place in a beige conference room at the law office downtown. The attorney, a tired man named Mr. Klemper who had handled James's affairs for 30 years, read the document aloud with the flat tone of a man who'd seen too many families splinter over lesser sums. The cabin went to me, sole and separate property. The gun collection, valued at roughly $80,000, was split evenly between Mark and me, itemized down to the serial numbers. Mark's jaw tightened so hard I could see the muscle jump below his ear, but he said nothing in front of the lawyer. That evening, he cornered me in James's study while I boxed up bank statements. The room still held the scent of James's pipe tobacco, and Mark stood in the doorway with his arms crossed, his voice dripping false solicitude. He told me the cabin was too much of a burden for a widow, that the property taxes alone would drain my savings, that he had a buyer lined up who'd pay cash, a developer who wanted to turn the land into a luxury resort, and that he was only trying to protect me. I told him I needed time. He smiled like an undertaker measuring me for a coffin. The discovery came less than 2 hours later. I was still in the study, sorting through the clutter of a man who saved every tax return since 1978, every bridge inspection report, every birthday card I'd ever given him. On the bottom shelf of a bookcase, behind a set of old assem manuals bound in cracked leather, I found a small wooden cigar box with a brass catch. The label was faded Cohiba, the cedar lining still faintly fragrant, and the lid opened with a soft creak. Inside were a few loose shotgun shells, a tarnished pocket watch that had belonged to James's grandfather, and a yellowed envelope with nothing written on the outside. The flap was tucked in, not sealed, and I was about to open it when Mark walked in. He glanced at the box, saw the watch, and his lip curled. "Sentimental junk," he said, and before I could react, he snatched it from my hands, walked to the metal wastebasket by the desk, and dropped it in with a hollow clang. "We need to focus on the important things, Laura. The estate has to be settled. This clutter is just noise." Then he left to take a call from his financial advisor, his voice carrying down the hall in clipped, anxious bursts, something about a margin call and a deadline he could not miss. I waited until I heard his footsteps recede, counted to 30, then fished the box out of the trash. The envelope was still there, stuck to the bottom by an old piece of Scotch tape I hadn't noticed before. I worked it free carefully, opened the flap, and unfolded a single sheet of lined paper torn from a legal pad. The handwriting was James's, unmistakable, though shakier than I'd ever seen it. The letters slanted hard to the right from the tremors in his hands during those final weeks. The note in blue ballpoint read, "Laura, my darling, I don't have much time. Mark is not what he seems. Do not trust him. Save yourself. The truth is in the blued steel, look to the muzzle. Forgive me for what I couldn't tell you face to face." Below that he'd written the date, just 3 weeks before he died, and his initials, the J and S looping together in the way I'd seen on 1,000 engineering drawings. I read it 4 times, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my temples, and then I folded it into a tiny square and slipped it into the lining of my purse. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that the loudest lies always crumble under the weight of patient, methodical truth. The manipulation started the very next morning early, before the coffee had finished brewing. Mark called me into the kitchen and laid a document on the granite island with the kind of theatrical solemnity that immediately set my internal alarms ringing. It was a handwritten amendment to the will, a codicil, dated 4 days before James's death, stating that I had abandoned the marital property at Loon Lake and therefore forfeited all claim to it and its contents. The signature at the bottom looked like James's, a looping J and a trailing S, but the body text was too fluid, too steadily penned to have come from a man who could barely hold a fork without spilling soup down his shirt. The paper was crisp, not the thin hospital stationery James had used for his actual last letters, and the ink was a dark gel that had never seen the inside of a hospice room. Mark told me he'd found it tucked inside James's wallet, a last-minute change of heart he'd been heartbroken to discover. He said he was filing it with the probate court that afternoon and that it would be easier for everyone, easier for me, if I just signed a quitclaim deed and walked away quietly. His tone was so gentle, so rehearsed, that I could almost see the script he'd practiced in the mirror. I stared at the paper and felt the note from the cigar box burning a hole in my purse. I didn't sign. I told Mark I was too exhausted to think, that my memory was foggy from the grief, that I'd barely slept since the funeral, and that I needed a few days to gather myself. He exchanged a look with Diane, the kind of look that says phase 1 complete. She squeezed my arm and said, "Of course, sweetheart, we'll take care of everything. You just focus on getting your strength back." 2 days later, I drove to the lake cabin to pick up a few personal items, some photographs, and my winter coat. The drive took 2 hours through pine forests and past old farm stands, and I remember thinking how peaceful the road looked, how utterly removed from the ugliness brewing back in town. When I pulled into the gravel drive, my stomach dropped. The back door was standing open, the jam splintered around the lock plate. Inside, the place had been tossed, but selectively. The gun safe, a heavy Sentry model bolted to the floor in the basement, had been pried apart with a crowbar, the door warped and hanging by one hinge. The collection was gone, every Colt and Winchester and Remington, except for a single rusty Derringer that had been overlooked on a high shelf, so small and insignificant that the thief must have missed it in the rush. I called the sheriff. 2 deputies arrived in a cloud of dust, took my statement, and began processing the scene. They dusted for prints and found my screwdriver on the living room floor, its tip scarred from the safe's lock. I recognized it immediately. It was the cheap Stanley from the kitchen junk drawer back at the house, the one I'd used to tighten the handles on the dresser. Someone had wiped the handle but left a partial thumbprint on the metal shaft that matched mine. The deputy's face shifted from professional sympathy to something harder. I was arrested that night for felony theft of property worth over $30,000, booked at the county jail, photographed, fingerprinted, and placed in a holding cell that smelled of disinfectant and stale sweat. My bond was set at $50,000, an amount I did not have liquid. I spent a sleepless night on a thin mattress, listening to a woman in the next cell sob about her kids, while the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry hornets. The next morning, Mark appeared in the visiting room, separated from me by a pane of scratched plexiglass, his face arranged into an expression of profound, theatrical disappointment. He pressed his palm to the glass like a televangelist and said, "Laura, I can make this whole ugly mess disappear. I have a friend who can get the charges dropped, but I need you to trust me. Sign the cabin over to me, agree not to contest the codicil, and I'll post your bail tonight. You'll be home by dinner. This arrest, this humiliation, it never has to see the inside of a courtroom." I let my eyes go glassy, let my shoulders slump, and I nodded. I said, "I don't know what's real anymore, Mark. The grief, the medication, I can't think straight. Just tell me what to sign. I just want to go home." He smiled like he'd won, and the smile reached his eyes in a way that a real smile of concern never could. I was out of jail by 4 that afternoon, after a bail bondsman Mark had arranged posted the bond with a 10% fee. By 7, I was installed in the guest suite of his 5,000-square-foot house on a cul-de-sac where every lawn was chemically identical, and the homeowners association fined you for leaving your trash cans out past noon. The guest suite was at the far end of the hall, with a private bath and a window overlooking the pool, and I realized with a chill that it was the perfect place to keep a compliant prisoner, close enough to monitor, far enough to ignore. Playing weak was the hardest thing I've ever done. Every time Diane brought me chamomile tea in a delicate porcelain cup and asked whether I'd given any thought to those pesky papers, I had to swallow the fury that was building in my chest and act like a woman whose will had been vacuumed out of her. I told them I was still too foggy, too traumatized, that the medication made it hard to focus, and that I needed a few more days. I deliberately left my purse open on the nightstand with a few clonazepam tablets visible in their orange bottle, perpetuating the image of a doped-up widow who couldn't manage her own checkbook. I shuffled when I walked, spoke in a soft, hesitant voice, and let them see me staring blankly at the television for hours. But at night, when the house went dark and I could hear the hum of the central air and the distant, tinny sound of Mark's voice on yet another panicked phone call, I started piecing together the architecture of the fraud. The investigation began with sound. From my guest room, which shared a wall with Mark's home office, I could hear him on the phone, his voice rising and falling in a cadence I recognized from years of dealing with insurance company bureaucrats and hospital administrators. The sound of a man who owes people money and can't pay, who is shuffling debts between credit cards and hoping the music doesn't stop. I heard phrases like balloon payment, 90-day delinquency, and refinance the bridge loan. So often they became background noise, like a radio station I couldn't turn off. One afternoon I was in the kitchen, ostensibly making myself a cup of tea, when their landline rang. An automated voice, crisp and clinical, said, "This is an important message from Caruso Asset Recovery regarding account number 631. And then Mark lunged for the receiver from across the room, knocking a ceramic mug off the counter. It shattered on the tile, and he fumbled the phone, yanked the cord from the wall, and told Diane in a voice that was trying hard to be casual that it was just a spam call. His hands were trembling. I watched the pulse in his neck flutter and filed that information away like a photograph. The first piece of concrete evidence came through a household accident, the kind of small, stupid disaster that can flip a power dynamic if you're paying attention. Diane had a silver MacBook Air that she treated like a Fabergé egg, hauling it from room to room to curate a lifestyle Instagram that apparently required hourly updates about artisanal candles and farmers' market kale. One evening, she balanced a full glass of Chardonnay next to it on the arm of the leather sofa, and when she reached for the remote, the glass tipped. A wave of pale gold wine flooded the keyboard, sizzling faintly as it hit the logic board. She shrieked, high and shrill, and Mark swore, and they both stood over the dead machine like it was a medical patient who'd flatlined. I walked in, took one look at the sticky keyboard and the dark screen, and told them I could probably fix it. I explained that I'd spent years repairing ventilators, pulse oximeters, and infusion pumps in the hospital, devices with sensitive circuit boards and liquid damage risks, and a laptop wasn't that different. Diane's relief was immediate and suspicious. She practically thrust the machine into my hands and said, "Just get our files back. Whatever you do, all our financial records are on there." That laptop gave me a reason to be in Mark's office unsupervised for the first time. I told them I needed an anti-static work surface, good lighting, and a set of precision screwdrivers, and Mark, after a brief hesitation, waved me toward his desk. The office was all dark wood and leather, with a view of the cul-de-sac and a tall HON filing cabinet in the corner, the kind with a single keyed lock at the top. While I had the MacBook open on the desk, its guts exposed, carefully cleaning corrosion off the RAM slots with cotton swabs and 99% isopropyl alcohol, I let my eyes wander. The filing cabinet was locked, but the lock was a basic wafer design, 5 wafers with no security pins, the sort of thing any locksmith's apprentice could defeat in under a minute. That night, around 2 a.m, after I'd confirmed that both Mark and Diane were asleep, I retrieved my father's tool roll from the bottom of my suitcase. I hadn't touched those tools in years, but the muscle memory was still there, the familiar weight of the tension wrench in my left hand and the small half-diamond pick in my right. I inserted the tension wrench into the bottom of the keyway, applied a gentle, steady torque, and used the pick to rake the wafers, feeling for the slight give and the tiny click that meant each one had cleared the shear line. The plug turned with a soft, satisfying snick, and the drawer slid open on oiled runners. Inside, I found exactly what I'd started to suspect. There was a manila folder labeled Loon Lake with a rubber band around it, and inside that folder was a draft of the forged codicil, complete with scratch-outs and margin notes in Mark's handwriting. He'd written things like add abandonment language and use medical date to match hospital stay, and there was a sticky note with a list of legal phrases to incorporate. There was also a loan application from a private lender called Pacific Crest Capital, dated just 4 days prior, seeking $210,000 against the value of the lake cabin, secured by a power of attorney that bore my forged signature. The signature was a clumsy imitation, the L too sharp at the top, the loops too deliberate and evenly spaced, and I could see exactly where Mark had practiced it on a separate piece of scratch paper using a light box, the ghostly outline of my real signature visible underneath his trial runs. The loan terms were predatory: 18% interest, a 2-year balloon payment that would come due like a guillotine, and a prepayment penalty so steep it would have buried me financially before I could even blink. Even worse, attached to the back of the package was a promissory note with my name on it, already notarized with a raised stamp, and a signature that looked suspiciously like the notary's name I'd later learn was a friend of Diane's from her book club. The whole package was a trap, designed to saddle me with a crushing, unpayable debt while Mark walked away with the cash and the cabin free and clear. I photographed every page with my phone, making sure to capture the margin notes, the scratch-outs, and the lightbox practice sheet, then reassembled the folder exactly as I'd found it, down to the angle of the rubber band. The next morning, I began looking for the blued steel James's note had mentioned. Before he died, James had given me a small, .32 caliber Colt police-positive revolver that had belonged to his father, a compact, heavy little piece with a worn blued finish and checkered walnut grips. It wasn't part of the main collection, just a personal piece he wanted me to have for protection, and I'd hidden it during the initial chaos after the arrest, taking it to my sister's house for safekeeping in a shoebox in her guest room. Under the pretense of retrieving some old photo albums for a memory project I'd mentioned to Diane, I drove out to my sister's house, a 40-minute trip through winding country roads. My sister, Carol, was worried. She could see the strain on my face and whispered that I should just walk away from the whole mess, but I told her I needed the revolver. She retrieved the shoebox from the back of her closet, and I tucked the gun into my bag wrapped in a dish towel. Back at Mark's house, I waited until they were both out at a dinner party, then locked my guest room door and examined the revolver under a bright desk lamp. I removed the wooden grip panels with a tiny jeweler's screwdriver from my father's tool roll, prying them gently away from the frame. Behind the right panel, pressed flat in a recessed cavity that had been meticulously carved into the steel, was a small roll of onion skin paper, tissue-thin and brittle. I unrolled it with trembling fingers. In James's handwriting, smaller and more careful than the note, were the words, "Passphrase, Harper's Ferry 1859. Speak it only at First County Trust, in the presence of the trust officer. They will need your fingerprint. This is the lock that cannot be picked. Below that, a small diagram of a fingerprint scanner and a note. The trust activates on my death. Mark cannot access it without you, present and willing. He will try. Do not let him. The dead man's switch was so elegant, so perfectly aligned with the man I'd married, that I sat on the edge of the bed and wept for 5 full minutes. James had been an engineer to his bones, designing structures that distributed stress so evenly they could survive earthquakes, and he had clearly approached his own death with the same meticulous, load-bearing logic. I had no idea what trust he meant, but the next morning I called First County Trust and asked to speak with their trust department. A receptionist transferred me to a man named Mr. Hendricks, and when I gave him my name and James's, his voice shifted, became lower and more deliberate. He asked me to come in immediately, said he'd been expecting my call for weeks. The meeting with Hendricks was the pivot point that transformed me from a victim gathering evidence into a counterattack in motion. He was a soft-spoken man in his 60s, with a bow tie and the careful, measured diction of someone who'd spent 40 years managing other people's money in a quiet office with frosted glass windows. He pulled a thick, bound document from a fireproof safe and laid it on the conference table, the pages fanning out like evidence. James, it turned out, had set up an irrevocable asset protection trust 18 months before he died, a sophisticated legal instrument that used a spendthrift clause and a duress provision to shield property from exactly this kind of attack. The trust held the title to the lake cabin, and its terms were ferociously airtight. Any attempt to sell, encumber, or transfer the property required my physical presence at this specific branch of First County Trust, my live fingerprint scanned against a biometric template on file, and a verbal passphrase that only I could provide. The passphrase was the master key, a sequence of 3 words chosen for their unguessability, not a pet's name or a birthday, but a piece of Civil War history that James knew. I'd remember from our trip to Harper's Ferry years ago. The trust document even included a poison pill, a nuclear option. If anyone tried to force a transfer without my voluntary participation, if a court order was issued or a forgery was attempted, the property would automatically and irrevocably convert to a charitable land trust, managed by a conservation nonprofit that protected watersheds, and Mark would never see a single splinter of it. Hendricks told me that Mark had already visited the bank twice, once with a lawyer and once alone, brandishing the forged codicil and demanding a title transfer. Each time, Hendricks had calmly asked for the passphrase and the biometric verification. Mark couldn't produce either, and his frustration had been so visible, so unprofessional, that the bank's internal fraud unit had already flagged the activity and opened a confidential file. Hendricks said that if I was willing to cooperate, they could coordinate with the county fraud unit to set up a controlled meeting, a sting operation where Mark would be invited to bring me to the bank under the pretense of finally executing the transfer, and the entire attempt would be recorded. I told him about the forged loan documents, the power of attorney, the lightbox practice sheet, and the phone calls from asset recovery firms. His expression didn't change, but he picked up a yellow legal pad and wrote something in a tight, neat hand. Then he said, "Mrs. Callahan, there's a forensic document examiner I'd like you to speak with. Her name is Dr. Elena Vasquez. She is very good at what she does, and what she does is dismantle forgeries in front of a jury." Doctor. Vasquez worked out of a small office near the county courthouse, a 3rd-floor walk-up crammed with bookshelves that sagged under the weight of corpus linguistics journals, forensic style manuals, and bound volumes of the Journal of the American Society of Question Document Examiners. She was a compact woman in her 40s with sharp, dark eyes and the kind of focus that made you feel like you were the only person in the world. I gave her the photographed draft of the codicil, the margin notes in Mark's handwriting, a sample of James's genuine handwriting from a birthday letter he'd written me 3 years prior, and several pages of Mark's own business correspondence that I'd managed to photograph while he was out. She spread the documents across her desk like a surgeon laying out instruments and began her analysis. She explained what she was doing as she worked, a stylometric analysis that measured vocabulary frequency, average sentence length, type token ratio, function word usage, and the frequency of passive versus active constructions. James's genuine writing, she found, showed a strong preference for first-person active constructions, a low frequency of passive voice, and a consistent use of the endearment, "my dearest," at the start of every letter. The codicil, by contrast, was larded with archaic legal jargon like heretofore, whereas, party of the first part, ab initio, and lis pendens, phrases that James had never once used in any known document, not in a single engineering report, email, or personal note. The syntax had a signature pattern of embedding dependent clauses that matched Mark's business correspondence with an 89% statistical probability, a figure she derived from a chi-square analysis of clause length distribution. She also analyzed the physical signature under a video spectral comparator, a machine that magnifies ink strokes and reveals stroke order, pressure, and tremor patterns. James's genuine signatures showed a consistent tremor-induced micrographia, a tiny, ragged shakiness caused by the small-cell lung cancer's effect on his fine motor control. The codicil signature was fluid, deliberate, with even pressure and no tremor artifact whatsoever, a hallmark of a slowly traced forgery, likely produced on a lightbox. Her report ran 11 pages and concluded with a certainty rating of highly probable, approaching practical certainty, that Mark had authored the codicil. She filed a sworn affidavit that same afternoon, and a copy was hand-delivered to the prosecutor's office. While the legal machinery was grinding into motion, I staged the test that would strip away any last shred of doubt about who these people really were. I waited for an evening when Mark was particularly agitated, pacing the living room and snapping at Diane about a voicemail he'd received from Pacific Crest Capital. The interest clock was ticking, and the bank's internal fraud hold had frozen the loan application, and he was starting to smell the trap closing. I put on an old cotton nightgown, walked to the top of the staircase, and let myself collapse against the banister with a crack that echoed through the 2-story foyer. I made sure the noise was loud and chaotic, a full-body slump with a guttural gasp and the heavy thud of a body hitting the tile at the base of the stairs. I lay there with my eyes closed, one arm twisted beneath me, and I listened. Mark's footsteps approached, quick and sharp, then slowed. He stopped less than 2 feet from my head. I felt the air shift as he stepped over me, his shoe brushing my hair, and then his voice, flat and utterly indifferent, said, "Get her purse. The trust paperwork should be in the side pocket. She probably still has the original note from Dad in there, too." Diane knelt beside me, but her hands weren't checking my pulse or shaking my shoulder or dialing 911. They were rifling through the zippered compartment of my bag with a frantic, scrabbling sound. I heard her say, "It's not here, maybe the nightstand drawer," and Mark snapped, "Then go check, I'll watch her." He stood over me and I felt his gaze on my face, and then I heard him mutter, almost to himself, "Just don't die on the tile, that's a whole liability mess." I kept my breathing shallow, my body limp, until they both retreated to the upstairs bedroom to search. Then I opened my eyes, rolled onto my side, and lay there on the cold tile with the pattern of grout pressing into my cheek, and I let the last ember of family obligation die out completely. They hadn't asked if I was breathing. They hadn't reached for a phone. They'd stepped over a woman they believed might be dying to rifle through her belongings. In that moment, I stopped being a grieving widow and became the thing James had been trying to protect from the start, a counterweight, a trap, a person who was done being nice. The confrontation came 2 mornings later, on a Thursday, under a sky the color of old pewter. Mark woke me at 7 with a cup of coffee and an itinerary printed on crisp white paper. "We're going to the bank, Laura. Today's the day you get to do something useful for this family." He'd arranged everything. An appointment at First County Trust, a notary he'd hired standing by, the forged loan documents in a leather portfolio, and the quitclaim deed for the cabin already filled out. Diane had laid out a blouse for me on the bed, something beige and forgettable, and she'd even placed a pair of sensible loafers by the door. They clearly believed I was still a foggy, compliant shell of a woman who'd sign anything to avoid going back to jail, a broken thing they could steer into the bank and prop up in front of a notary. I played the part in the car, staring out the window at the strip malls and car dealerships sliding past, while Mark rehearsed fake reassurances in a voice that was strained at the edges. "This is just a formality, Laura, a little paperwork, and then you're free, no more stress, no more lawyers. We're doing this for you." At First County Trust, we were ushered into a private conference room off the main lobby. It was a bland, beige space with a long, polished table, a water pitcher, and a single window looking out onto the parking lot. Hendricks was already there, seated at the head of the table with a leather-bound ledger and a calm expression. Next to him sat a woman I'd never met, a sharply dressed blonde who Hendricks introduced as his assistant, but who I later learned was a detective from the county fraud unit, her recorder already running in her jacket pocket. A small black camera, no bigger than a thimble, was tucked discreetly into the crown molding above the door, its lens angled down at the table. Mark spread his papers across the polished surface with the flourish of a salesman closing a deal. The quitclaim deed, the durable power of attorney granting him full financial control over my affairs, and the Pacific Crest loan documents requiring my signature, my fingerprint on a biometric pad, and a photocopy of my driver's license. He pushed a heavy fountain pen toward me. "Just sign here, here, and here, Laura. Then I can make all of this go away. The theft charges, the legal fees, the bail bond, all of it. You'll be free." I picked up the pen. I looked at the forged signature already on the loan application, the clumsy L and the 2 even loops, and I said very softly, "This isn't my handwriting, Mark." His face tightened, a muscle twitching under his eye. "It doesn't matter, it's a pre-filled form, you just need to ratify it. Don't make this complicated, Laura." I put the pen down. I picked up the codicil, which was also on the table as a reference document, and I held it up so the light caught the ink. This isn't James's handwriting either. He never used the word heretofore in his entire life. He called me my dearest, and he wrote on hospital stationery, not on 24-pound bond paper with a gel pen he didn't own. "You wrote this yourself, Mark, on a light box with a ballpoint, and you practiced my signature on a scratch pad that I photographed in your filing cabinet." Mark stood up, his chair scraping the floor with a sound like a scream. "You're hysterical. You've been doped up on anxiety meds for weeks. You have no idea what you're talking about. Sign the papers or I'll have your bail revoked and you can rot in that cell." I looked at him, and I let the mask drop, all the fake fog and the trembling voice and the shuffled steps. I said, calm as lake water at dawn, "I don't sign for liars." It wasn't loud, but it was final. The air in the room went brittle and sharp. Mark lunged for my wrist, trying to grab my hand and force my thumb onto the biometric pad that was connected to the bank's verification system. His grip was hard enough to bruise. That was when Hendricks spoke, his voice carrying the weight of 40 years of quiet authority. "Mr. Callahan, this meeting is being recorded as part of an active federal investigation into loan fraud and forgery. I would advise you to release Mrs. Callahan's arm immediately." The door opened, and 2 plainclothes detectives from the county fraud unit walked in, badges clipped to their belts, one of them holding a copy of Dr. Vasquez's sworn affidavit, and the other holding my photographs of the Pacific Crest loan package. The assistant next to Hendricks stood and identified herself as Detective Teresa N.G., and she informed Mark that he was being detained for questioning in connection with multiple felonies. Mark started shouting about attorneys, about harassment, about how I was a crazy old woman who'd lost her mind. Diane, who had been hovering by the door, went pale and began to cry, real tears this time, mascara streaking down her cheeks, though I suspect they were for herself, and not for the husband whose grip was now being cuffed behind his back. 20 minutes later, they were both escorted through the lobby in handcuffs, past the startled tellers and the customers clutching their deposit slips, and a prosecutor was on the phone authorizing formal charges for forgery, attempted grand theft, conspiracy to commit fraud, and malicious prosecution. The aftermath unspooled over the next 18 months, a slow, grinding machinery of depositions, discovery motions, and court dates that tested every ounce of patience I had. Mark was convicted on all counts after a 5-day trial where Dr. Vasquez's testimony, delivered with charts and chi-square analyses and a video spectral comparator demonstration, left the jury visibly stunned. She showed them the tremor pattern in James's real signature versus the smooth, practiced strokes of the forgery, and she walked them through the clause-length distribution data so clearly that even the alternate juror, a retired plumber, was nodding. Mark was sentenced to 4 years in state prison and ordered to pay restitution of $180,000, a judgment that forced the sale of his house, both cars, the boat he kept in dry dock, and the complete liquidation of his investment portfolio. I received a check from the court-appointed receiver about 6 months after the verdict, drawn on the proceeds of the seized assets. Diane accepted a plea deal for conspiracy to commit fraud and got 18 months of probation with 100 hours of community service. But the public humiliation was its own sentence. Her social circle evaporated, her Instagram account went dark, and the last I heard she was working at a cosmetics counter in a mall 2 states away, living in a studio apartment above a dry cleaner. The malicious prosecution claim for the staged break-in and the theft charges moved through civil court separately. I hired a litigator named Patricia Okonkwo, a fierce woman with a reputation for dismantling fake claims, and we sued Mark for damages including legal fees, lost wages, the cost of the bail bond, and the emotional distress of spending a night in county jail. The jury heard testimony from the sheriff's deputy, who had found my screwdriver, and Patricia demonstrated that the thumbprint had been lifted from a drinking glass in my kitchen and transferred, a trick she'd seen in a dozen fraud cases. The jury deliberated for 4 hours and awarded me $400,000. Collecting on that judgment was surprisingly straightforward because the seizure of his assets had already frozen a pool of liquid capital held by the court. The check cleared 6 weeks after the appeal period expired, and I deposited it with hands that were perfectly steady. I used the money to renovate the lake cabin, which the trust had protected throughout the entire ordeal like a legal fortress. The cedar siding was power-washed and restained, the roof replaced, the dock rebuilt with new pressure-treated planks. I reclaimed the half of the antique gun collection that had been recovered when police raided Mark's storage unit, a dusty space in an industrial park where he'd stashed the Colts and Winchesters beneath moving blankets. I sold a few pieces at auction through a specialty house in Dallas, a rare 1873 single-action army that fetched nearly $30,000 alone, and used the proceeds to fund the renovation and an endowment for the retreat. The rest I kept as a memorial to James's foresight, displayed in a locked glass cabinet in the living room with a small brass plaque that reads, "He knew." The cabin itself became a non-profit retreat for women recovering from financial abuse and coercive control, a quiet place where the only demands are the sound of loons at dusk and the gentle lap of water against the shore. It has kayaks, a screened porch with rocking chairs, a library of legal self-help books, and a volunteer attorney who comes once a month to review documents for free and help women understand their rights. At the end of the dock, mounted on a cedar post, I set into the lake bed myself with a post-hole digger and a bag of quickset concrete. There's a hand-routed wooden sign. I made it in the workshop James had set up in the garage before he got sick, using his old router and a piece of white oak. It says, "Justice Preserves." The letter's deep and clean, and every time I walk past it, I think about the cigar box in the trash, the blued steel of the revolver, the passphrase that unlocked a fortress, and the man who loved me enough to hide a lock that nobody's greed could pick. James had been an engineer to his bones, building structures that didn't collapse under pressure, and in the end he built one for me. The trust was his bridge, the note his blueprint, and every morning I stand on that dock and watch the sunrise over water that belongs, irrevocably, to the women who need it. Integrity isn't just about telling the truth. It's about planning for the moment when someone will try to take it from you, and having the quiet patience to wait until the machinery they built to bury you crushes them instead. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely? How did you handle it? Let me know in the comments. If you believe that the loudest lies always crumble under the weight of patient, methodical truth, hit like and subscribe. Until next time, stay sharp.